Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you're all doing well. It's your favourite-ish top 5, top 10, I would say. Your top 10 Twitch spin and go streamer that's currently active, coming at you with a new video. The guys have been asking me to see if I can review a hand for the content. Can we see how it goes? Let's see how it goes. I think it's going to go well. This is a hand from the Triton High Roller. I swear I've never seen it before. I thought it would be fun if I did a little, going to review it live for the first time. So I don't know if there's been a history or anything like that. It's 60k, no limit hold'em, 8-handed about a month ago. There's 33 left. I guess we're not on the money. And we've got Mr. Jungleman against Daniel Cates against Bruno Volkmann from Brazil. Looks like there's been a blind v blind clash. Bruno's limped in. Daniel's ISO'd. Let's see what happens, huh?
Certainly too good to fold.
I would agree so far with the commentary. Thank you very much, commentators.
Top pair against bottom pair here on a queen high board as Volkmann wants to see Jungle deliver some more chips toward the middle.
So this is fortunately, I didn't know this would be this way, but fortunately a blind v blind spot, we have at least a little bit of overlap with spin and go theory, so we can talk a little bit about the flop and some of the strategy details about this. And so blind v blind I think is always a very interesting one. I think especially ISO pots. Historically, there'd be a lot of, it's one of the, I will give you a little bit of insight into some of the strategy for those that are interested. When you're talking about donking strategies, blind v blind ISO pots are one of the more donked situations in poker. Typically, if you have, like, let's say, 2 or 3 middling cards, you'll typically find a bit of donking. And so let's say, for example, this wasn't Queen 6-2, but Queen 6-8 or Queen 10-8 or something like that. You would certainly expect to see a reasonable amount of donking from the small blind, at least in theory. Whether it happens in reality, obviously depends on situations. We can see Daniel took a 5-2 off, and so he's clearly ISOing wide, and could be some ICM pressure, we don't know, maybe some bubble pressure. C-bet seems pretty standard, you would guess. Goes for a 35k sizing. All seems fine so far. I would guess Bruno looks to be check calling so far, but let's see.
Check raise. That's a bit annoying, of course, for Cates.
Check raises. So check raise is obviously very viable as well. It's certainly a hand that's good enough, and certainly theoretically will, I would imagine, I'm trying to find the exact stack depths here, but it looks like they're 40, 50 BB deep, so will be a little bit wider. Typically, I think Queen 9, absolutely reasonable. It will get uncomfortable in certain spots because, let's say if you're a beginner to poker and you're trying to construct a check raising strategy, you can check raise your good hands and think about hands that you're very happy to stack off, and you can check raise some more weaker hands, some bluff hands, which would be hands that are like, maybe take your tier of hands that are just not good enough to call and check raise those. Typically, that's not a bad strategy formulation in a lot of spots. Queen unsuited here. I don't know if Bruno is planning to check raise and commit. Could be the case, certainly in the blind v blind spot. I certainly think it could be reasonable. Again, we'll have a lot of dependence. But this is one of the challenges. If Jungleman is picking up perhaps that Bruno is check raising an increased frequency, especially of a more mergy range, which certainly wouldn't be a read that you would think would be beyond many of the top regs. That's one of the challenges that Queen unsuited check raising it can face, because now you're stuck with Queen 9 and you have basically a bluff catcher. You're not beating value. We don't expect Jungleman to be ISOing and then C-betting and then re-raising with Queen 8 or Queen 7 or anything like that. So your Queen unsuited is a bluff catcher. It has got backdoors. That's quite nice for us. So we've got the backdoor spades working for us.
Wow.
But I agree with the woo.
Volkmann has to give credit to Cates for a very strong raise.
So Volkmann's in a bit of a tough spot here. As we mentioned before, he's basically bluff catching at this point. He has got some backdoors. I think they will. It's unlikely you're going to check raise and then fold top pair with the backdoor spades. The SPR gets interesting too. So we're looking at just over a 1-to-1 SPR, and so just under a 1-to-1 SPR. Sorry, the chips hadn't updated, and so yes, I think in terms of hand selection for Jungleman, the 5-2, the bet and raise, somewhat reasonable. Although, yeah, typically, let's think it can be fine. I'm sure it will be fine at some frequency. In theory, again, I think this is going to be more related to what I would perceive as a mergier check raising range, and so maybe trying to take advantage of that by not allow, if you never, for example, raise versus a check raise, your opponent gets to check raise a much wider range, and so having some raises versus check raise as part of your strategy is something that's going to be helpful.
The call was hoping perhaps for a spade on the turn. Instead, it's a king, and now all of a sudden, Cates is.
So the king of clubs, really interesting turn. Certainly not a great card when we think about the two range versus range interaction here. I would expect when you think about the imposition player with a 1-to-1 SPR, it's very unusual if they're going to, let's say, c-bet and raise a check raise with a flush draw. Which flush draws are we looking at here? Like, would you take ace-6 and do that? Pretty unusual, right? And so this is whereas the check raise themselves can of course have a flush draw. I mean, it's very reasonable. Any of their flush draws might have chosen the check raise, and they're certainly not going to fold to the re-raise, especially the small sizing. So this is 100% a better turn card for the out position compared to the in position. Whether it's enough to, let's say, allow for some donking strategies would be really interesting. We're a little bit into uncertain territories now, so it will depend a little bit on the range construction of both players. The wider that you expect Jungleman to be able to c-bet and raise versus a check raise, the more that you'd probably anticipate theoretical donking on this turn. Now, with his hand, it doesn't make too much sense, right? But let's say he had a more marginal hand, you might choose at this point to donk it, or if you had a stronger hand, you might choose to mix in some donks there too. Let's say, for example, you had something that unblocked some of damage continues. Probably wouldn't want to have the ace of clubs flush draw. But let's say you had something like just a 10-9 of clubs or a 9-8 of clubs especially. It may have been, if you were going to try and implement a donking strategy, implement some of that, and then you want to mix in some bluffs or some weaker hands. Weak hands are kind of tough here, and so I don't know what the, let's say, quote, weakest hands would be that you would check raise and call a 3-bet. Possibly if you continued with like a 4-5 of spades or something like that, which I don't think you would, to be honest. And I'm trying to think of the weakest, like, one club combo. Maybe you would check raise some 6x with a club, possibly. It seems pretty weak too. So it's a pretty tough one. I think checking's absolutely fine. Jungleman will have an interesting spot here, and I think I would lean check with his hand, but yeah. And he does choose to check. I think he puts the puzzle together, and will face with an interesting decision.
Because 4 clubs showing up, neither player having a club.
So I completely agree with Maria. It's a really interesting run-up for sure. Bruno obviously checks this river. It, again, has some interest about whether his hand is worthy. So I think when you've check-raised this hand, and I think when you've then check-raised and then been re-raised and then called, you're pretty close to the bottom of your range, at least in terms of the value range. Do you have a worse hand? Like, do you have any air on this run-out? I would suggest probably not. So is there any merit in thinking about trying to turn a hand into a bluff that doesn't beat, for example, a hand like ace-queen, which would be a very reasonable opponent, range for our opponent to have, right? They would check raise ace, let's give them ace-queen hearts. And given the amount of clubs here, which we could certainly have some, is it unreasonable to maybe even think about stretching as wide as queen 9? Now, I don't know what Bruno makes of his check raising range. Maybe he's wider than we think. Maybe he's going to check raise pretty wide and then also call pretty wide. Out of position, pretty dicey move. But I certainly think he's lacking a little bit in terms of the air range part of his range. And so it would be an interesting thought process to think about, can I sometimes maybe even turn this hand into bluff because I'm at the bottom of my range and actually my showdown's pretty limited, but can I get better hands to fold? Well, absolutely. Especially if the other alternative is just to check fold and therefore lose to bluffs, which is an interesting move. Jungleman is a similar situation where he's pretty conclusive. Jungleman less so at the bottom of his range, right? Because he's c-bet, it's c-bet air, he's been check raised, and maybe he does actually have some bluffs that would choose to re-raise here. But he certainly, with a 2, isn't standing to win this pot ever, really, because we've already talked about how Bruno really doesn't have much air in his range. So Jungleman's checking EV, I would say, is pretty close to 0, and then it's just a matter of question of if he was to shove here, is he going to achieve the required folds? And that's going to depend a little bit on how Bruno decides to construct his turn and river ranges. Again, we don't expect there to be too many turn donks, either in theory or in practice, but there could be some. River, I would expect Bruno probably to check the majority of his hands, given that Daniel has a much wider range and can still turn up with air and can still obviously take this opportunity to bluff. And so it is interesting to consider whether that would result in the required folds. I would say checking is pretty close to 0 here, if not 0. I would say betting. Assuming Queen 9 is there, we can basically decide, take all the Queen X as a start, and obviously expect the ones with a club to call, expect the ones without a club to fold. You're already kind of close in terms of getting enough folds in that situation. So I think this would be a pretty reasonable shove here, and if Bruno doesn't hero with the Queen, pretty likely to be pretty successful. But let's see what happens.
Ready to move it in, most of it.
Is it going to be 400?
So Daniel does choose to shove, almost shove. And let's see what Bruno decides to do.
All of Kate's chips.
Does choose to call. I think the check call is reasonable. I think with the SPR, it is reasonable to expect, let's say, unpaired clubs often to be sometimes considering shoving the turn. So let's give Daniel, for example, a hand like Ace 10 with a club. Does it ISO small? Maybe. Does it c-bet the flop? Maybe. Does it raise the check raise? Probably not, right? So we're really slightly struggling to give Jungleman enough nut flushes here. But of course, yeah, as we mentioned, could wake up with air. Now, of course, he can wake up with air. It also means he could wake up with, let's say, a hand like just 10-9 with a club or something, or 10-8 with a club or whatever. So lots of interesting considerations to make. I thought Bruno called there. He did call, and I think clearly he's hoping to see a hand like this. And fair play, Bruno. He played it in a slightly unorthodox way, but what I will say is that the more you suspect your opponent is capable of taking these moves, the less, and especially given your plan was not to check fold, I now take away any of those donking river considerations. That makes a lot less sense if the plan was to check call. I was assuming he was check folding. I thought this was a successful bluff I was getting shown, but apparently not. And in terms of Jungle's play, a very interesting decision to raise over the top of the flop check raise. I don't know the history of these two players, if there maybe was something there where he thought I can attack this spot a bit more frequently. But a valiant effort nonetheless, and certainly puts the pressure on. But perhaps Bruno put the pieces together. Now we could do a little bit of quick Flopzilla work if you're interested, ladies and gentlemen. Let's just see. So we've got some Flopzilla. We've got the two ranges. So this is the pre-flop. We've got the small blind, limping and then calling the ISO, and this is the ISO range. You can see the ISO. Firstly, you see what we discussed in terms of the middling cards being very, very favourable. And so if we were to pick a middling board, let's say we picked a Queen 10-9 or something like that. I think we talked about that. You can see that at this point, the equity advantage goes to the small blind. One of the reasons why I see some donking on those boards. And if we picked a Queen 10-2, you can see that has a bad. The 2 is a very disconnected board card for the small blinds range, whereas this 2 actually helps the in position ISO's range, because they still have, of course, all the 6s plus in their range, whereas our opponents doesn't have the very top end of the range, but is more merged. And so a way to think about ranges, a merge range is quite middling, doesn't often have the top or the bottom, whereas a polar range, or in this case it's actually just a pretty balanced widespread of ranges, has the top, has the bottom, has the middle, has a bit of everything. And therefore on kind of disconnected boards, favourable for the guy which has the top of the range. On middling boards, would be more favourable for the guy who has the merge range. Anyway, let's put in the actual board that they had. So we've got in this case a Queen to 6 of spades. You can see it has definitely a range advantage for the ISOer, and so we'd expect to see c-betting sometimes. When we do c-bet, are there any combos here that we would say we would eliminate from a c-betting range, like maybe jacks, for example? Possibly, it's difficult to say exactly how the strategy worked. Maybe some Queen 3, maybe some Queen 4. For the moment, we'll just leave in the c-bet as range. We'll just assume a range c-bet. And then we can talk about what we expect our opponent to do with parts of their range. And so we know they check raise their Queen 9. So we can say for sure that the Queen 9 plus is part of this check raising for value range. I don't expect any opponent to find reasons to check raise Queen 9 and not check raise Queen 10. So I would assume Queen Jack, King Queen would all be check raised as well. Probably Queen 5, Queen 4, Queen 3 wouldn't be check raised so much just because of the weaker parts of that range, and so we can certainly take those out. I would take out some of the 6x from check raising. It might still be in their sliver. Maybe some of the loose 5s again, I think just check call. Bottom pair, maybe, but again, it's pretty unusual, I would say. Flush draws, maybe. We'll take away complete air. Gut shots, again, could be in there. Backdoor flush draws would be more likely to be part of a check raising strategy, and it's like not impossible to eliminate any of these necessarily, so we'll leave some of those in. And of course combo draws could be there, and likewise the top of the range could be there. So the range looks probably something along like this when it check raises. And we obviously have our 5-2 off. Doesn't have the best amount of equity, but we chose this time to re-raise as well, obviously in combination with the rest of our range. So we've c-bet, we've been check raised. When we re-raise, we're really repping let's say, having this portion of value beat. And so it's really important to figure out what we're trying to represent. And what we're repping is basically having Queen 9 beat at this point. So how much of a range has Queen 9 beat? Well, this is what we're repping really in terms of like, more realistically, I would say like King Queen plus. I don't think Queen Jack necessarily would c-bet, get raised, and then just decide all the chips, please. May choose to check call and keep some more bluffs in. Obviously, you don't expect 7s to Jacks to be in there. We don't expect too much 6x to be in there. Bottom pair is there, obviously, and so we don't know which bottom pairs are going to be there, but obviously some of them. We can eliminate some of them, probably. So I would say, for example, it's less likely... I don't know if it's less likely the King 2 or the Ace 2 would be there, but given it's a bluff ISO, and Ace 2, King 2 has more playability, has better outs against Queen 6, for example, it's more like they may call, and then we don't expect just complete air, although it's possible. Right, and so it's difficult to say. Flush draws, possibly, but maybe not always going to be there. Gut shots again, maybe. Typically, I wouldn't expect Ace King to be there because again, when we think about it, when we're re-raising, there's definitely a very, especially with their SPR, a very viable chance we just get shoved on. And so I'm not too sure we take weak flush draws. Ace high flush draws, King high flush draws. Sure, they decide to check raise and just get it in. I would say we can eliminate flush draws without. A 6 might go for it, maybe a combo draw, maybe. But I would say we'll leave the kind of 10-9 of clubs out of that range because unlikely. And gut shots, possibly. We'll leave them in. Yeah, something along these lines. I would take away overcards. Flush draws paired, maybe as well. So again, when we've re-raised, we then have to go back to now the small blind and decide on their range and what are they going to continue. And so, will they continue with all of their top pairs that they check raised? Probably. You're unlikely to check raise them and then fold them, I would suggest. Will they check call all of their backdoor flush draws? Less likely. So when we think about the bottom of the range, are they going to check raise and then call with a gut shot? Probably not. Flush draws definitely could be. And we'll take away the backdoor flush draws. And the combo draws obviously still going to be there. And then again, 2 pair plus still part of that range. So something along these lines. Very interesting when we think about what are good cards and bad cards for a turn. And so if we were to pick, let's call it a bad card. So look at these numbers up here, ladies and gentlemen. We see 53% versus 46%. And let's pick the Ace of Clubs. That would be, we think, a good card for the small blinds range. 68%. It's a really good card. Likewise, the King of Clubs, which does come. A good card for our opponent's range. And so I would not be surprised to see, in theory, you'd actually probably see a hell of a lot of donking on this turn, but in practice, probably not so much, especially given that practice is different. What would be bad cards? Well, a 2 would probably be pretty terrible, given there's not really any 2x in our opponent's range. Likewise, just a blank kind of low card is bad. So if we picked a 2 of hearts, again, pretty terrible for our opponent. If we picked a 4 of hearts, it's okay. 3 of hearts, very middling. The majority of cards will be pretty middling, but there's going to be obviously a few exceptions. And so the clubs will be a big one that steps out. And so when this King of Clubs rolls off, we see a massive range advantage for our opposition. It therefore makes sense to see a sort of check from our opponents. And then we can't really define so much the small blinds range when they check. In position, can we define this range better? Difficult. Could they check back a flush? If they had the Ace of Clubs, could they check it back? Possibly. It's a 1-to-1 SPR and they're in position, which makes sense. Would a set check back? Maybe. Does 2 pair check back? I'm inclined to say no, if I'm honest. I'm inclined to think that shoves the turn, but it's not impossible, right? Jungleman certainly could be capable. Aces could be there, right? Aces with a club certainly would be some reasonable. Flush draws, definitely possible. Ace queen with a club, certainly possible. Stuff like that. And then anything else? I mean, obviously the weaker parts of their range are all there as well. So we eliminate a few combos, but really we don't do too much definition in terms of sticking to any particular part of the range. And then the 3 of clubs comes. And so, again, actually a fairly neutral card for both ranges. Our opponent, when we think about it, their weakest hands, you can see we're actually, if we've ranged them accurately, it is that queen 9, queen 8, etc., etc. And so you could, again, make some theoretical ideas to maybe turn that into a bluff to try and target ace queen, etc., etc., although it is ambitious. It depends. I would expect maybe what happened was Bruno decided I just won't have any betting range on this. And part of that is because we're trying to target our opponent's this part of the range, right? This big 48% that could turn into a bluff. And the one pair, etc., etc. We're obviously hoping 50% of the time our opponent has a flush, but the weak flushes aren't going to shove. Probably you would expect something like a 10 of clubs plus to always shove. And then you expect a set to check back and 2 pair, if they river 2 pair in this case, to not check. The 1 pair, I would say probably the aces or the ace queen doesn't turn into a bluff, and maybe the 2x and 3x might. We know it did in that case. And so their range could look something like that. And then when we think about it, if we were to just give our opponent the queen 9 here, so if we were to say they only have their 1 pair hands, and how much equity does that have? You can see that their 1 pair has 47% equity. So even if we were to eliminate and just give them the queen 9, in this case of spades, 47% equity, they make a pretty good call. Well done, Bruno. Boa sorte, obrigado. That was Texas Tomo Reviews a Hand in a lot of detail. I hope that was interesting. Maybe not, maybe yes, but we're trying to something different from the spins. If you enjoyed it, let us know by liking the video. If you didn't enjoy it and you think, idiot, put more spins on please, let us know by disliking the video and writing negative comments please. That will be very much appreciated. Thank you very much everybody. I hope that was interesting. If there's demand for it, we'll try and do some more hand reviews, famous hand reviews or historic hand reviews, or anything. If you have any requests of a hand review maybe that hasn't been, I know there's a lot of hand reviews on YouTube, but there's something that you feel like hasn't been covered yet and you'd like to submit it, let us know in the comments. And we'll see you soon on the Twitch for some spins where we're playing 15 or 25 BB max, where we're comfortable at. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Peace and love, and we'll catch you soon. Cheers.